Hello and welcome. Before we begin with our content today, we wanted to cover a few technical details that you'll need to participate in today's virtual town hall. We invite you to turn on your webcam so we can see each other during today's town hall. If your camera is not already on, or if you need to turn it off for any reason, you can access the video controls by mousing over the bottom of your Zoom window. The video controls are in the lower left-hand corner. Remember to remove any tape you might have blocking your webcam so we can see you. You have two options for connecting to the audio portion of our town hall today. You can use the audio through your computer, or you can call in on your telephone. To switch between those options, click the up arrow icon next to the microphone icon at the bottom of your Zoom window and select audio options. All attendees are currently muted, and we'll ask you to keep yourself muted until invited to speak. After our speakers are finished with their introductory remarks, we do want to hear from those in the audience, but we'll need to make sure we do so in an orderly fashion. To indicate that you'd like to contribute to the conversation or ask our panelists a question, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom. You can find the option to raise your hand by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your video screen. Participants will appear in our queue in the order their hands are raised, and will call your name and unmute your line when it's your turn to speak. If you decide you no longer want to chime in, you can click the option to lower your hand and remove yourself from the speaking queue. You can also use the chat function if you want to add comments or links to our discussion. Please note that we may not be able to ask our panelists questions that are only entered into the chat, so remember to raise your hand if you want our panelists to address something specifically. If you don't have a microphone or would prefer not to speak in today's town hall, you can use the chat to send a question directly to me, Terry Hines, as the host, and I will ask your question in the order that it's received. If at any point during today's town hall you have technical difficulties, please use the chat to send a message directly to me, again, Terry Hines, as the host, and I will do my best to assist you. Our session is being recorded and will be made available in the next few days, so if you have colleagues who are unable to join us today, please feel free to share the recording when it is made available. Thank you for your attention, and now without further ado, we'll turn things over to our hosts from the Public Policy Division, Stacy Heldman-Holguin and Debbie Heida. As soon as I find them to unmute them. All right.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Stacy Holguin, Associate Vice President for Student Affairs at Sonoma State University, and Debbie Heida, Vice President of Berry College, and I welcome you on behalf of the NASPA Public Policy Division. We chose to tackle the topic of free speech on our first public webinar because it's a topic that is impacting our campuses across the country. Free speech and the related questions that are being raised by the activities on campus are going to continue based on the national politics that we're seeing today. And we wanted to provide an opportunity for people to come together and support each other and learn from each other about what we're doing in practice on our campuses. We have two speakers who both recently worked through very high-profile speech issues on their campuses, and each of them will share a little bit about their campus, the recent activities that they've managed there, and one or two things that they've learned along the way in that experience. We'll then open the floor to discussion as Terry described. Our speakers are Bobby Woodard, Vice President of Student Affairs at Auburn University, and Alan W. Groves, Dean of Students at the University of Virginia. Vice President Woodard, why don't we start with you this afternoon?
Thank you, I appreciate it, and welcome to everyone. Give you a little update. Auburn University is located in Auburn, Alabama. We are a public institution, just under 30,000 students total enrollment, with about 40% of them coming from out of state. We do have a board of trustees. We are not part of a system, so we have a localized board of trustees, which as we go into a little bit more of communication, you'll see why that's important. For us, we had last fall in November, we had Milo come to campus, and he was brought by one of our student organizations, and one of our student organizations was paid to bring him to campus. Before then, he had been at a couple other institutions. Texas Tech was one that we called and talked to him about what he had there. It was very brief. It was, he chose a different topic at every institution. Ours was feminism, and why is it bad for the females in today's environment? and he had a conversation. We put him inside with 400 seats. The biggest thing that we had issues with him was the graphics on the side of his bus. And so we actually parked his bus in the loading dock and then put a garbage truck beside it so it would block the graphic on the outside, as it was offensive graphic on there, and we could do that. So we did it. They were paid, the student group, and then the president, after they left, the president of that student group was harassed so much by faculty and staff and students that we had to give him protection detail for about 2 weeks going back and forth to class. This was before the election of last year, and so we thought we were done with it. And then come April, probably February of this year, we had a student at Georgia State University, which is about an hour and a half north of us, that made a request for space on our campus for a speaker. He preferred outside space, and at that point in time, we did not know who he was talking about. And at that time, our policy allowed for anyone to come on campus, and you didn't have to have a sponsor on campus to have that. We then found out very quickly it was Mr. Spencer, Richard Spencer, that was coming and who was speaking. So the first date was denied only because we had too much going on campus. We had our spring football game, and parking was taxed and police were taxed. And so we pushed him off. And then he wanted to come back in April. So they came back in April and wanted to select a different date. And as we did our research, we called everybody together, led by the provost. It was the provost, our vice president for institutional diversity, our general counsel, police, and communication. We talked about this. There were a lot of discussion in that group. There was discussion in that group, and we took a vote on whether we should allow it or not, knowing that when we denied his request, we would be sued. And probably, based on what our general counsel was saying, we would probably have to have it anyway. The vote was a close vote, and it was 2 votes to the good to cancel. And after long discussions, about 2.5 hours of discussion, we decided to cancel the event. At that point, it went to our court system down in Montgomery, and we lost. We lost the event. We knew we were going to lose the appeal. And not only in the appeal, we had to pay for his lawyer fees. So for us as a university, as a public university, it cost us about $28,000 for a day and a half for lawyers to figure out what we knew that we were going to go ahead and have to have. At that point, since we knew that we were going to lose it anyway, we were working with our local police and our communications. I will tell you one thing that we did not do well and we still need to improve on is our communication to campus, including our students. We have a new president now, and so it might change a little bit, but our president at that point in time did not like to put out public statements for or against anything. And so at this point in time, the provost put out a couple of statements, but the biggest flack we got were from parents and faculty and staff and students about their safety. In this time, I think Mr. Spencer only spoke at 4 other institutions before he came here. We talked to those. We looked at Texas A&M, was the most recent before he got here, and we reviewed their video, and we called all of our counterparts at Texas A&M and talked about what went well, what didn't go well, why you had them, why you didn't have them, and so forth. It really helped us. So we started planning. We created a phone bank, and the phone bank went really well because people will call. We had about 712 phone calls in the first 16 hours of the announcement. We had a phone bank. The one thing we need to do better of is rotate those phone banks and make sure everybody has a script on what to say, because I would say something, Alan would say something, or somebody else would say something else. And so we weren't giving the same message out to our staff, faculty, and to our community and alumni. At that time, we started working with law enforcement. Small group got together, started planning what we were going to do. Mr. Spencer wanted to be outside. We did not want him to be outside. As a public state institution, we do have to give free speech area, but we did in negotiation of the suit, we said that we will put him inside into a 400-seat auditorium where we can control the entrance and exit of his people and where we can determine where he goes. At that point, we put him in there. We knew he'd come straight off the main street, come in the back way. He brought 9 vehicles with him, and about 32 people. The 32 people sat up front. They were all dressed exactly the same in khaki pants and white shirts. when he came in. He had a film crew with him doing a documentary, and of course his attorneys were with him at that point in time. It was my job to make sure he had to pay for the room, and not necessarily security, but had to pay for the room rental. So I wanted to make sure he got his receipt. I gave him his receipt and told him that he would have a specific time to speak. Once that time expired, he would be asked to leave. We would cut the microphones off and so forth. He understood. He said, I'll be out of here by then. And he ended right on the time that we told him that he had to end by. Law enforcement, we work with our public safety and our local police department, and they are the experts. They have been trained in this. We let them lead that. We spoke to them about what our concerns were on campus. And just so you know, we had the FBI here, the SBI, which is our State Bureau of Investigation, our local police department, the Auburn Police Department. We had 4 other local municipalities come, the Highway Patrol. We had 12 sheriff's officers, 2 bomb dogs, and 3 crowd control dogs, 14 undercover officers. We had a 12-person SWAT team, and of course we had fire and rescue. Fire and rescue mainly was the fire were here to turn off the fire alarms and do fire watch, so people were calling a bomb threat or so forth. And of course rescue was here just in case we went over anything that we needed to have. We specifically chose a location of where he was going to be because we knew we could barricade it. And so we kept it barricaded with concrete barriers and also steel barricades. We made the general public stay 157 feet away from the door entrance of the building that they went to. And only the people that were allowed in there were a count by how we counted the number of 400 people that could come in, wait in line to go inside. At that point in time, that kept a distance between the people waiting to come inside and the people that were out just to see the event. We made a conscious effort that we allowed no mask on campus. And at the beginning of the event, we had 6 people come with masks covering their face. They were abruptly asked to leave. 3 of them left, 3 of them stayed by taking off their mask. We never saw them again, and that helped us make sure everybody was identified. We did not allow drones. We had 1 drone that come, and we confiscated the drone. We did have officers on the rooftops just in case. Before the event started, when people were in line, we did have 1 fight in the crowd. 3 people were arrested. 2 of those individuals from Atlanta, which is 90 miles northeast of us, and 1 from Montgomery, which is 45 minutes south of us here. No student was involved in that. We did have about 45 to 5,000 people waiting outside to see the festivities, as you want to call them. And then the day of the event, we had 1 person respond to the media. All media requests went with them. Any media requests that wanted to be on inside the event or at the event had to have security detail with them, and we require that of them. They were okay with that. They paid for that themselves. We did have a counter event that the students wanted to lead. We took our sheriff's department. There are 12 sheriff's deputies that wanted to be there. They're used to working in the county by themselves. So we figured we could ship them off over there because they're used to not having a lot of backup. We put them in the middle of the campus, and we had about 3,000 people show up for our counter event, which was music, food, and so forth. That was paid for by most of the student groups and a little bit from student affairs. We worked with facilities to get all that stuff taken care of at the same time. We did have undercover officers, and those undercover officers were here the day before Mr. Spencer visited all night, and they were here during the school day because, as we noticed, he didn't speak till 7 or 8 o'clock that night. I think it was 7 p.m. that night, and we had people show up around 8 a.m. that morning. You could tell by the way they were dressed or tattoos or how they looked, does not look in place on our campus. So what we did is we had undercover officers throughout the whole day. They went to classes, they walked around. And so that worked out really well for us to keep an eye on people. We had a lot of people come from Atlanta and Birmingham to our campus, and we knew that was coming. We worked with a couple of anti-defamation leagues to find out what information they knew beforehand, to find out who would be coming. And of course, we had our social media and our OCM, Office of Communication and Marketing, for the week in advance to monitor Twitter and all kinds of social medias to see who was coming. And that's how we knew how many people were coming for the most part. We took our younger staff and we put them over in our counter event. We wanted to make sure they were at the counter event because they had a better relationship with our students day to day than most of our senior staff did. And also they needed a little bit more time to process what was going on. We took our senior staff and made them work the Spencer event up and close, inside, outside, and around the event. That's because they have seen a lot, been around a lot, and emotionally knows how to separate themselves from the event to make sure that our students are safe. That was always what we were telling our students, was to be safe. We never told our students to stay away, because we know if we told them to stay away, they would not stay away. We asked that we did not want them there because it was easier for us to manage, but we did not ask them to stay away. And to end up going to lessons learned, I will say that David at University of Florida called when he knew that Richard Spencer was coming. We talked about pros and cons, what we did well, what we didn't do well. Just about 5 things to run through of lessons learned is we need better communication with our campus about what's coming. Some liked that we had them, some didn't like that we had them, some thought that we invited them. The communication is very critical in telling them that we are a public safety institution and we have to protect free speech. And then their whole debate comes between hate speech, free speech, and offensive speech. But at this point in time, we need to do a better job with that. I talked about the phone bank. We need to get with the president and decide who makes the final decision of whether we have them or not have them and how we're going to push that. We did meet before this event. After Milo, the president, myself, and the provost 10 times a semester, so once a week for the most part, we would meet with a different student group. We continue to do that today. And I'm very appreciative of our president provost for doing that. I would say that you have to keep your board of trustees or senior administration, including the deans, involved so they know what's going on so they can help you with that. And the last thing I will say is that you have to be honest with the students, make sure they know what's going on, make sure they have a voice. And we made sure any scoop, for lack of a better term, that we had with media or anything we were putting out, we made sure our student media had it first and our student newspaper had it first so that they can have the scoop on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And Alan, how about you? What was your experience?
Well, I think the whole nation kind of knows our experience, given how broad the coverage was. So I'll begin by saying good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you all are. I'm Alan Groves. I'm the Dean of Students at University of Virginia in Charlottesville. So our incidents, there were 2 separate ones on August the 11th, which was a Friday night, and on August the 12th, which was a Saturday morning and into the afternoon. We knew coming in, unlike Auburn and Florida and some of the other cases, we did not have any reservation or booking that Richard Spencer or anyone else was going to come to the University of Virginia on either of those days. We did know, and the city and county and state had known, that there was going to be this so-called Unite the Right rally that had been planned in Charlottesville for the late morning of Saturday, August the 12th. If I remember correctly, I think it was supposed to start at 11 a.m. or 12 noon. So we had been planning for that and talking about that as the summer came in. We had in early July, we had about 40 Klansmen from North Carolina come up and have a rally in a downtown park, and about 1,000 community members were there to meet them. And it ended up being a somewhat chaotic scene. Tear gas was ultimately deployed at the end. So we had a little bit of a dress rehearsal that if this came to Charlottesville, that it was going to be a challenge for the city and the county and the state authorities to try to contain and control. That, as I say, had happened in the midsummer. We then began to talk about this planned event in Charlottesville, we being the senior leadership of the university, that we knew that this Unite the Right rally, which was going to be much larger, was going to be coming on Saturday, August 12th to downtown, where 2 Confederate monuments are that the city has been debating and discussing removing and had already renamed those 2 parks. The week prior to August 11 and 12, so that immediate week prior, every morning at 8 a.m., the senior leadership of the university had met, chaired by the president, public safety, me, other key leaders, to talk about the planning for Saturday. The president had put out a message to our students about the Saturday event, urging them not to go. And as you can imagine, in the days that would follow, there was some debate about whether that was the right message. But the president believed that was the right message, and I understand and agree with why she was urging students for safety not to go. even though many of them would later say they felt they had to be there to confront these alt-right individuals, fascism, etc. So that message had gone out to our students, and then we had begun to plan alternative programming. So what we did was planned for Saturday at the same time the rally would be going on downtown, that UVA would have its faculty doing a teach-in in a number of spaces around our libraries on all sorts of issues relevant to equity, social justice, the Civil War, etc. So we had planned a whole bunch of programs that we hoped would be an alternative for our students and our community members that would be safe. And some churches in the community had also planned some things downtown, but away from the park where this rally was supposed to occur. And I say all of this because, and I'm going to blend in now some lessons learned as I tell you what happened. The focus that everyone had coming in was on Saturday the 12th. There was no information that we had until very late that there might be anything at the University of Virginia spontaneously on Friday night, the night before all this was to happen. Indeed, the state police that were coming in, 60 state police had come in July, hundreds were coming in this time for the Saturday event. They were to arrive sporadically over the course of Friday evening to be ready to be deployed first thing Saturday morning. The university police were helping the city police patrolling areas of the city so that the city could focus on the areas where they thought this was going to happen. Virginia has something called the Fusion Center, which came up after the 9/11 events. And the Fusion Center is a center that basically monitors social media and looks for any intelligence that can be gathered on terroristic threats or acts of violence. I say that because after the fact, we would learn that the Fusion Center, which was advising our police and the city police, never picked up anything on social media that this was going to happen at the University of Virginia on Friday night, the night before the big rally that everybody knew had been planned. We now know from a document that has been leaked out to the press after the fact, a planning document for the alt-right groups that were coming, that the piece at UVA was to be kept secret and was not to be shared or discussed in any way publicly, that was to be a surprise, and that they would get information that afternoon about where to meet up and what to do. At the same time, these groups were putting out misinformation that they were going to have a rally late Friday night in a park, public park on the other side of Charlottesville. And indeed, that's where the police, the city police, had been focused, was on this public park on the other side of the city from the University of Virginia. What has come up since then was some of our student activists and a faculty member, one in particular that I know of, perhaps a couple of others, have said that late Friday afternoon, and I think the 4 o'clock time frame, that they picked up some things on social media that indicated something might be coming to the university. But the university's law enforcement and the Fusion Center had not picked up on that from their own intelligence. I can tell you from my vantage point, the first that I learned was a call from the president at 8:23 p.m. on Friday night. She called me at home, and I'd gone home because we were going to all report at the crisis center at 7 a.m. Saturday morning to manage the day, which we, of course, ended up doing. She called me at 8:23 to say a student on the lawn, a student leader, had told her, the lawn being the center, the heart of our institution, that a student had told her that there may be something coming, an alt-right march that was going to come to the statue of Thomas Jefferson at the Rotunda that night at 9 o'clock on Friday night. So she called me at 8:23. I hopped in the car and drove in. And when I got to the lawn, keep in mind, this is a week before our first-year students move in and about a week and a half before the fall is supposed to begin. There were a handful of upper-class students that were looking to move into their lawn rooms, probably 5 or 6 of them that I chatted with, and a professor of politics who lives in one of the pavilions on our lawn. If you've ever seen our lawn, it's the part designed by Jefferson. There are 10 two-story pavilions and interspersed around 50 student rooms that are reserved for fourth-year upper-class student leaders. So it's a faculty and student living area that's the heart of the university. So I chatted with some of those young men that were moving in, and they had not seen or heard anything. I chatted with Professor Sabato, and he said he had heard something but hadn't seen anything. So I went to the other side of the rotunda where the Thomas Jefferson statue is. There were probably 10 community members and students just kind of standing around. So I called the president, who was at her house, and I said that I was at the rotunda. It was 9 o'clock, but there was nothing happening. And she said that the information she had received was that they were a small group of them was going to march up the street the public street in front of the university, have a 15-minute speech at the statue, and then leave. And it was probably about 30 minutes later that I heard a loud roar, almost like a stadium, a football stadium off in the distance. And I called her and said, "Did you hear that?" And she said, "I did." And I said, "Can you tell where it's coming from?" And she couldn't. I also had reached out to our police. And then I got a message from the professor who was on the lawn saying that he was hearing that they had torches and they were marching not up the street, but through the center of the university and about to come to the lawn. So I ran to the other side of the rotunda and I saw them marching up. It was visually not anything I'd ever seen. There were probably 200 to 300 of them with torches. We now know what they had done is they were marching in the center with the torches and had anybody that was 190 pounds or bigger out on the edges to be able to be security and essentially engage anybody that tried to disrupt the march. As I said, there were a very small number of people on the lawn because we weren't in session. Our students hadn't started to come back except in small numbers. Professor Sabato viewed them as they came up. And still something that strikes me as laughable in hindsight, I walked up and put my hands on my hips and stared at them and got, like that was going to do anything. But I figured I would express my physical displeasure. As they came up the lawn, they then went up the steps of the rotunda. I now know Spencer was in the middle. I didn't know that at the time. And then they began to fan out over the rotunda to the other side, which I couldn't see. So I ran around the rotunda to the other side and saw that they had formed a huge circle with their torches around the Thomas Jefferson statue. And they were cheering and chanting. And then a faculty member came running up to me and said, "Alan, the students have been surrounded by these guys." And I said, "You mean the students are inside there?" And he said, "Yes, there's a group of them inside and they've been surrounded." So I went in through the crowd of the alt-right guys with the torches to get to the students who were in the center and leaned in. They were holding a banner and they had linked arms around the statue facing the marchers that had surrounded them, but they had baseball caps to try to shield their faces. So I leaned in and said to them, it's Dean Groves, this is unsafe, let me get you out of here. They told me, "No, sir, we think we're okay, And I continued to talk to them, and it didn't last long. I was probably a couple of minutes into telling them I wanted to get them out of there when one of the protesters took a torch from behind me and threw it as a spear, and it hit me on the arm. And so I admit I yelled an expletive and turned around, and then all heck kind of broke loose in terms of the violence. So myself and the professor began to pull the students out of the crowd. The police came running in. They had been monitoring it across the street. They came running in, declared unlawful assembly. And it was pretty much for a short period of time, bedlam. I think I and several other people got maced, and it was a messy situation. So if I'm focusing on the 11th and not the 12th, which happens downtown, I would tell you a couple of things. One is there was a very clear effort to spread misinformation about what they were doing. They had obviously never reserved any space. They had never said they were coming. And we now know, had tried to put disinformation out about where they were going Friday night so that they would surprise the university and the authorities. Certainly, we learned some lessons about our own policies. We had probably out there that evening, because this was a surprise, I think something like 15 police officers. The state police we could have called in, and they could have called in earlier if we had any indication. And looking back, I think when you have something like this that you know is going to happen in your city or town, knowing that the night before there might be something targeting the university was a good lesson, I think, for any school now going forward, given what happened at UVA. We had to look critically at our policies. We had an open flame policy at Virginia, but it wasn't a regulation, it was a policy. And that meant that the police couldn't enforce it under Virginia law. So what our Board of Visitors did right after this was changed our open flame policy to a regulation that our police can now enforce, and any police officer can enforce. And also expressly mentioned tiki torches and things like this, which is what these fellows had. The second thing they did, because Virginia is an open carry state where you can open carry firearms, the university has a regulation that says you can't carry a firearm in a facility, a building or a football stadium, things that have been declared facilities. Because the lawn, although it's open air, is residential in nature, we then had the board classify the lawn as a facility so that no one could bring a firearm onto the lawn in the future, because many of these guys were open carrying and had firearms on their hips, which obviously unsettled the students and faculty that were there that evening that saw this happen. So both of those were significant changes for us, just from the standpoint of policies to try to address something like this if it happened again. The president has now tasked 2 groups in the aftermath of this to look at 2 other aspects of how we do things. She took the deans of the academic schools of the university, chaired by the dean of the law school, to have a dean's working group to look at open spaces at the university. We're a pretty wide open, kind of free speech protective institution. And so what they're looking at is a lot of these large open air public spaces and what should be the approach that we take. And the 2 changes I just mentioned to you came out of recommendations from that group. The second task force, chaired by me, is to look at how we do space reservation. Unlike Bobby's situation at Auburn or the folks at Florida and some other schools, outside entities or individuals cannot reserve our space. You have to have a faculty or department or student sponsor, or student group sponsor. But we are looking critically about how do we have our space reserved. We're a very decentralized place where you might reserve one space through the music department or one through the provost or one through the dean of students office. And so there's not a lot of information sharing to let you know that while this is happening here, this may be reserved over here. So we're looking at how to change that approach and what's the best way for us to know what's happening in all these spaces. We're also looking critically in light of Florida and Cal Berkeley at how to impose the costs that come for security when you have a speaker or an event like this that's going to bring about tremendous resources, public safety resources that are going to have to be brought to bear. As I mentioned, I'm a lawyer. I spent 16 years litigating in federal court before coming back to my alma mater 11 years ago. And one thing that helped was this summer, we have a big conference, week-long conference for about 55 key student leaders. And I had spoken to them for about an hour and a half on free speech law, on incitement, on true threats, on the exceptions to free speech, but the fact that much hate speech is protected speech and is different than a hate crime. And so that hour and a half that I spent with our student leaders on the law and how this works in a public university ended up, I think, being helpful because after August 11, I was able to sit down with them the following week and they had a base of understanding of this. And when they told me what their concerns and frustrations were, they were coming at it already with my having had a previous conversation with them about what it means in a public institution to have the First Amendment and how that applies. But I think, you know, a point Bobby made, which is a terrific one, is the way in which we communicate. So one criticism we took from a lot of parents and a lot of students and a lot of faculty members was why hadn't we triggered a text alert that Friday night once we realized these guys with torches were on the lawn? It's a fair point. And certainly we've looked at the Cleary aspects of that and whether it was covered. It doesn't appear that it was covered in that context. But certainly the question is, should we have sent an alert and a warning? The downside of if we had done that is we would have drawn more people who had come into town to come confront and combat these individuals. And the situation might have turned even more violent, as it did the next day in Charlottesville when the alt-right individuals clashed and physically assaulted a number of individuals. On the other hand, that alert, I think, might have been helpful for our community, who later were very upset that why didn't we know this was happening? And so we've had to really look critically at how we do these kinds of alerts and warnings and the context in which we should send them. The second point on that note is messaging, you know, from the university. The president's initial message on this when it all happened was criticized by some folks for not being forceful enough on calling out the racism and the anti-Semitism of what was happening. And a second, stronger message came out later. And I think we've seen this at other institutions in terms of the importance of that initial messaging. I think the University of Florida's FAQ they did, their questions and answers about Spencer's visit, is among the best I've seen, where they really lay out all the different questions. You know, they learned from Bobby, they learned from us, but they did a terrific job, if you've not looked at that webpage, of saying, here's the question, what's the answer? Here's the question, what's the answer? That I thought was really terrific, and I think going forward, that's helpful. The last point I'll make real quickly, there was a terrific piece in Inside Higher Ed, I think in the last couple of days, that talked about the importance, even when we as public institutions explain the law to our students and others, that we begin by acknowledging the fear, the hurt, the ugliness of what's happening before we then segue into a conversation about, but here's what the law requires and here's the constraints. I think that's very good advice, because if you start with the law and you start with the First Amendment, I think for a lot of our students that's not going to resonate well, and they're going to feel like, but where's the moral argument? Where's what's right? And I think when you start by showing them that you get this and you're concerned and you care about the impact, but then talking about the legal framework, I think it positions us better.
Wow. Well, thank you both for sharing. I'm sure that many in our audience have questions, so I'm just going to review how you could go about contributing to our conversation. We do want to hear from you, so please feel free to contribute let us know you want to contribute by using the raise hand feature in Zoom. And you can find that option to raise your hand by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll appear in our queue in the order that your hand is raised, and we'll call your name and unmute your line when it's your turn to speak. If you decide you no longer want to chime in, you can click the option to lower your hand and remove yourself from the speaking queue. You can also use the chat function if you want to add comments or links to our discussion. So in a few minutes, I will put in the link to the Florida Q&A that Alan just mentioned, so that folks can grab that if they would like to. But if you also don't have a microphone or would prefer not to speak in today's town hall, you can use the chat to send a question directly to me, Terry Hines, as the host, and I will ask your question in the order that it's received. So with that, we will turn it over to Diana, who's going to moderate our questions.
All right. Thank you, Terry. So we have a question first by Michael Schutt, and I'm going to unmute you now, Michael.
It's for you. Did you all consider, as you were talking about the text alerts and the implications of doing text alerts and bringing more people out, about doing a shelter-in-place alert because of what you were seeing and experiencing, and given that there were residence halls around there?
So yeah, I assume that's directed to me, and can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. We've talked about that after the fact. One of the issues in terms of is different universities look at what I'm going to call the command and control. For us, those alerts are dictated by a combination of the chief of police, of university police, the Clery Act director, and the chief operating officer. So student affairs, for example, is not part of that conversation. One thing that we did since then is put out a chart for our community and said, here are the different kinds of alerts we might send. Here's a Clery alert, here's the text alert, here's what we call a timely warning. I think if we were to do it over again, based on the conversations we've had since then, we likely would have done what's called a timely warning, which is not a Clery alert, but is a text message that we would have sent out and said, do not come to the lawn. And I think in fairness, that's where some of the criticism came, is we had sent out one of those alerts in the spring when a baby bear was running around the medical center. And students were saying, so, you alert us for a baby bear, but not for, 300 Nazis. I mean, it's a fair point.
Okay, thanks.
Diana, do we have another question?
We actually do not. Feel free to raise your hand. Folks might be having a hard time seeing the raise your hand feature. Oh, okay, we do have one from Tara Benson. I am going to unmute you now, Tara.
Hi, really appreciate you all taking time to talk with us. We've had a lot of conversations about this at Missouri State and trying to learn a lot from everything that's been happening. One thing that we're kind of coming across is, how do you find out which of these speakers are potentially going to bring some controversy with them? Because, we have a lot of spaces that get reserved or maybe not reserved. There's not really a way for us to just go and research everybody who makes a reservation or a speaker. So I'm wondering how you handle that.
I think for us, I think it's different per institution and where you're going. For us, we have the SPLC down in Montgomery, which is 45 minutes from us. Of course, they're on our campus probably weekly, good, bad, or indifferent. Depends on how you feel about what they're talking about at that time in place. So we have a good relationship with them. We call it the Anti-Defamation League out of Atlanta. We work with them a lot and to see what they know. But I think we really rely on, when we do know that a speaker is coming, is our colleagues and see where they've been at since then. And I know when we heard Richard Spencer was coming, there's about 30 other people, colleagues I sent out and said, hey, have y'all had him, and what the internet will tell you. Now we're kind of decentralized, like Alan was talking about, and we have done a better job of getting that through one central location of putting it through there. When Cameron, the student that made this reservation, it took us about 2 weeks to decide or to get from him who he was actually bringing. So I think at that point in time, there's always speakers that are going to pop up on your campus that you don't know who they are or what they're going to bring with you. You just hope that, or I could say, we just hope that we find out who they are. We can do a little bit of research to find out who are they bringing. The good thing is we work with 18 to 22-year-olds for the most part, and they usually slip up and they'll put something on Twitter or put it out there. And so we know, and we have 2 students in our student media that does nothing but monitor social media for all kinds of different stuff for the university. And they do that, and that's how we found out. But I don't think there's a silver bullet for that.
Alan, anything to add?
No, I think that's a fair point. And for so many of us who are public institutions, we have to apply our standards in a content neutral way. At the same time, we also know that, Charlottesville was a game changer. I've read enough articles now where people say after Charlottesville, I'm actually giving the keynote tomorrow at the Virginia Student Services Conference on the First Amendment after Charlottesville. And I think that as we think about our policies, we need to be content neutral, but we often have to be mindful of how do we have better gathering of intelligence when space is being reserved. For example, we at UVA are looking at pushing back out the amount of time within which you must make a reservation before the talk, so that there's a chance to evaluate and see, should we move that reservation to a different location, a space that is better suited to be able to manage the potential protests that might happen, even as we make sure that we're facilitating the opportunity under the Constitution for that speaker to speak. So I think everybody's got to go back and look at their policies and see where are the gaps, where are the holes, where are the challenges, and how do we fill those in a way that fulfills our legal obligations but better prepares us to know and to know and plan for something before it happens.
And Alan, you had mentioned looking at UC Berkeley practices, which is my prior campus, where I spent 22 years trying to keep a lid on things as they go there.
They've just put out an interim policy, by the way.
Exactly.
We were looking at that last week in my task force meeting. And by the way, real quickly, as a non sequitur, there's a great article in the Atlantic magazine. I'm a subscriber, so I get their emails, but it's called The Lost Boys. And it's basically, I saw it this morning in an email. It's in their new edition. And it's looking at the alt-right and Charlottesville and basically positing, and I think this is true, that Charlottesville was something of a disaster for the alt-right and for Spencer. And it's a pretty good article about where do they go from here in us trying to get a handle on what they might do next, where they might go next. But it's a good article that I read this morning that I would recommend to you.
Bobby and Alan, can I ask that you respond to the kind of human piece of this? So when you talked about the inside higher ed piece, encouraging public statements to acknowledge the emotion that students have about what's happening on their campuses, what were the things after the fact that you did that responded to how students were thinking and feeling about major things that are disruptive on campus or hurtful and controversial?
I think Alan's situation was totally different than ours. And I think you can hear that by the way he talked about it and by reading in the news. Ours was a lot different than, no one lost their life and didn't go into the city and so forth. But for us, the biggest thing we did is we try to communicate with our students the whole time and listen. I mean, we're only here for the students mainly. And so we want to make sure that's always heard. The biggest thing for the students were that, I had the president and the provost and myself once a week meeting with different student groups that we select and that we can talk to them and they're seen. And after the Spencer thing, we were almost to exams. We had about 2.5 weeks before they went into exams, final exams for the spring. So I had them come to the student center and sit, and we would just talk to people. So it's kind of making them visible. The other thing we have to worry about is our staff. We wore our staff completely out about 2 weeks before he came, during the time he came, and about 2.5 weeks after he came, because we were doing, I wouldn't say damage control, but we were talking to students and telling them that we're listening to them and that they matter, We're going to try our best to make our campus as safe as possible. We are an open campus, like most campuses are. And so we had to really work on our staff and force people to take leave time or take comp time to deal with that. But we also started a professional development process, mainly with our younger professionals, because some of them got a little more emotionally tied. And they heard from the students, like our new professionals in programming or in our multicultural center, would spend a lot more time with the students because they dealt with them every day. They'd come into their office, they had a relationship, and they were just emotionally worn out. So we worked with our counseling system, which is already taxed, but mainly what we did is just talked. And for what it's worth, we had a day to where we closed all of our offices at noon and just had I wouldn't say a party, but it was just a get together in our ballroom, and we had food and we just had fellowship and talked and just enjoyed each other, invited student leaders to come if they wanted to, and had open meeting for that way. And I think you handle it differently each way, and depending on what time of year it is. For Alan's situation, he can talk more about it, but they were gearing up for school to start. I mean, they were about to have all these freshmen come on campus. He had a whole lot different thing. I was towards the end of a semester, and so he had brand new students coming on. So that would be how we dealt with it.
Thank you.
Yes, so I concur in everything that Bobby has said. Oftentimes I think when we're in a crisis or an incident like that, it's easy to forget the toll that it's taking on our staff. And I remember the day after the 12th when everything was happening, and I was in the command center with the state police, the city police, et cetera. I had been there, I think, since 7 in the morning along with everybody else. And I remember at about 7:30 at night, one of my peers, an associate VP in student affairs, she showed up and said, I need to relieve you. You need to go home. And after everything that had happened on the 11th and the 12th, as much as my adrenaline was spiked and I wanted to be there, I thought that was pretty caring of her. And then I tried to do the same thing over the next few days with my folks. So this happens the week before move-in. My staff in the central office of the Dean of Students and I spent that whole next week, meaning the week of the 14th before move-in weekend, that weekend, fielding a lot of calls from anxious parents. And I think I was here every night till about 11, talking in particular with parents of incoming first years, incoming freshmen, students of color, who were saying, what does this mean? Who are these guys? Is Charlottesville safe? Is UVA safe? And so we really spent a lot of time trying to assure, and we totally changed the nature of move-in weekend and the president's talk and the work that I do with parents, because this was so much on everybody's mind. We had 3 students who were badly injured in that use of a car as a weapon. One local woman was killed, but a number of people were badly injured, and 3 of them were our students who were down there. I had another student who was down there who had videotaped it as it all happened and was deeply shaken. And so we were then trying to triage and support emotionally our young people who had been down there. We had a young woman that spoke very publicly at a rally we had at the university in our amphitheater. She is a Jewish student of color that lived on the lawn and was there that night. And one of the faculty who lived in a pavilion had brought her into the pavilion for safety when they began to come up the lawn. I mean, there are those kinds of impacts that our young people felt that required a tremendous amount of support and follow-up. So, and then we were fortunate. We had the entire university community and local community. We had estimates were 5,000 to 7,000 people then showed up later the week to have a candlelit march from where the alt-right individuals had marched with torches, the same path they had followed up the lawn. You've seen those visuals. They were extraordinarily powerful for our community that happened and that it happened the way it happened, because the torch-lit alt-right Nazis had been chanting, you will not replace us. One of the great visuals afterwards was the students saying, we replaced you, with that vigil on the lawn. So it was pretty powerful. Now that said, Richard Spencer knows what he's doing, and he came back in early October with about 45 guys. They bussed down from Northern Virginia. They went to the park. He knows the law. They stayed there with their little torches for exactly, I think, 20 minutes, and exactly 45 guys under the 50 threshold to reserve the park and get a permit. And then he laughed afterwards, went on social media and laughed and said, I came in for 20 minutes and triggered the whole town. So he knows what he's doing, and he's trying to poke in a way that traumatizes the community. And we've got to be sensitive to that and working with our young people and our staff members.
So I have a question that came in via the chat, and it is from Justin Tanner. How do these experiences change the dynamics of and collaboration with housing and residential life, knowing that students, staff, and faculty live on campus? More security, more training, practicing drills? What does that look like?
For us, Mr. Spencer was about as far away from any of our residence halls as we could put him. He was closer to downtown on purpose because of the access to getting him back to I-85, Interstate 85 and out. So for us, we didn't do anything different other than the week of and a little bit the week after. We had to make sure our security and cameras and everything worked in our residence halls and who can come in and come out. Now, training we did for all of our student staff on campus, not just in student affairs properties, but every place on campus. We did a campus-wide student training for different people. And I will say in our housing and residence life, they do a really good job of training and dealing with different ideologies that come in through the number of students that stay on our campus. So I don't know if we really changed anything dramatically because of Mr. Spencer was in and out here pretty quickly for us. So I don't think we did anything differently on that.
And for us, obviously, the sheer breadth and impact of what happened here, the fact that there was loss of life, community member, 2 police officers died, that there was so much of an impact and a visceral impact and such an invasion of the heart of the university by people shouting hate and carrying torches, and the historical connotations of what they were doing and yelling things like blood and soil and Jews will not replace us. And that they did it in the heart of the institution where students live, and a few of them had already started to move in. I think obviously there was tremendous, our resident staff members were in training when all this happened. And so the next day on Saturday, there was a lot of conversation with them about preparing for the impact on students. From a safety and security standpoint, we were, other than the changes I told you we made to the lawn about declaring it a facility and the changes to the open flames policy, most of our residential living areas are very secure in a lot of ways like yours are with swipe access, et cetera. There has been a broader impact though, in that, for example, to come into our football stadium now, we will only allow clear bags. You cannot bring in anything the way you used to, purses and other things. We have bought, I think, 75 metal detectors, and on large events that we're having now, we're deploying those. And so it has changed the nature and culture and fabric. And I suspect as we move a little bit away from August 11 and 12, we'll probably start to get some pushback as people, anytime you move away from something that was traumatic and people begin to forget that visceral feel and the impact of it, you may get pushback on saying, why are we having to have metal detectors at this university event? Or why can't I bring in a backpack? And we're going to have to manage that.
In the UC system, a lot of the campuses have moved to that as well, with the clear bags for any large events, the stalled access so that you're metering people as they enter any large event, so you can monitor what's happening. So those are, bi-coastal changes that are happening now.
But it's funny. We all pride ourselves as these wonderful open spaces, and I think the violence that we saw here and that we are beginning to see at other places is really causing us to rethink that cherished value of being the ultimate open space. And I think that's going to be something for those of us in student affairs that are going to have to navigate carefully and thoughtfully and engage our students as we do it.
I actually have a quick question if there is time. So I work as the policy analyst with NASPA, and it's just such a treat for me, honestly, to be on this call and hear these firsthand accounts because tracking this stuff at a state level doesn't show you what's actually happening on the ground. So thank you for that. So my question is about something Bobby mentioned earlier about this conversation that's popping up around the differences between free speech, hate speech, and offensive speech. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Alan's the lawyer, so I might have to defer to him on that. I'm just an education guy. We have I That's a hard question, Diana.
Yeah, I know.
So
Sorry.
what we happen is, what is free speech? What is hate speech? And then when does it become just offensive speech that you don't agree with? And so what we have tasked most of the directors and AVPs and above in student affairs to start studying when they go to their different functional areas conferences is, what do you consider that? Because a lot of our students will go by and, a good example, this is an easy example. If most campuses probably have the campus preachers that come, and at least the 4 states I've been in, we've had all 4 of them have had campus preachers. We get calls every year at the beginning of the year. Well, that person called me a racist, or that person called me a slut, or this or that because of what I'm wearing. And why is that? I'm offended. Why is that not, hate speech? And then we get into it to where you might not like what someone says. It does not mean that it has broken a law because you are offended by it versus what is hate speech. And I think Alan at the beginning of his talk talked a little bit about the difference between hate speech and I don't know if I say free speech. I mean, offensive speech, but free speech. So we're still trying to learn that. What is that? And trying to educate ourselves as much as educate our students, because something that might be offensive to you is not offensive to me. Our biggest thing here is trying to teach our students, okay, just because you don't agree with it does not mean that it's hate speech or that it's against the law. You have a right to your own opinion, as I have a right to my own opinion. Now, when it becomes physical touch or physical in nature, that's a different ball game than it is about speech. And if you're threatening someone, if I made a straight threat to Alan and say, Alan, you're going to do it. Now that becomes over the line, because now that becomes a threat. That's no longer just an offensive speech or an ideology. That's a threat. And that's something I think we all deal with. I would assume. I know I struggle with that a lot. What is that? And so, I mean, Alan, as a lawyer, all jokes aside, you might have a different opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's helpful, Bobby. And it's funny that this topic has become so big. Last spring, I spoke in Atlanta at the CUHO-I meeting for chief student affairs officers on this topic, and then did it again in Las Vegas for mid-level student affairs managers. And this topic is becoming important. So there's a couple of things I'll say really quickly. And by the way, in that Florida Q&A that they did a great job of explaining to their students that most hate speech is protected speech and is not actionable. So you've got a couple of things happening, and I'll try to be really compact in the few minutes we have. Most hate speech is indeed protected. There are 2 key exceptions under the First Amendment that have been developed by case law. One is this idea of true threats, which is Virginia versus Black articulates that in the early 2000s. The other is incitement, which is the Brandenburg case, which is a little older Supreme Court case. The challenge for both of those is they require, and Bobby hinted at this, a remarkable level of specificity and imminence. I am going to come to Bobby's office and shoot him in the head. All right, there you go, true threat, right? And the great example when I do this talk that I put up for people are the yik-yak threats that were made against Black students at the University of Missouri by what turned out to be a student at another Missouri school. They were very clear about tomorrow morning, do not come, because if you do, we'll be waiting in the courtyard and we will shoot you and I'm going to kill these people. That easily was something that could be gone after as a true threat and indeed a criminal offense, right? The other example I give our student leaders when I go through this with them is 2 things, 2 at Virginia. One was the room of a Muslim student who was an activist, and somebody wrote outside her room on the wall, terrorist, with an arrow at the room. Well, that comes within the university's harassment policy and is likely not protected speech because it's targeting an individual based upon a protected characteristic. On the other hand, I'll put up a slide that shows some chalking that was done outside of some dormitories that said, Islam will destroy liberty. That is clearly protected speech, even if we might find it ugly or hateful, right? And so I have found, especially I did a professional development session for all the student affairs division last week, and I go through a whole bunch of examples around the country after I've given them the standard. And I say, okay, how would you evaluate this? Interestingly enough, the one with the chalking, you go to your chalking policy, which we have. For flyers, you look at, is it, even if you're content neutral, right, is it appropriate to post a flyer there? We can't take it down based on content if it's protected, but we can consistently apply our policies about where things can be posted and what can be done, trying to be as broad as we can. But the challenge for many young people is they believe that hate speech is the equivalent of a hate crime. And in explaining to them the difference between a hate crime, the best example I can point to recently is the Bowie State student, the African-American student about to graduate who was murdered by the young man from the University of Maryland, and where there were apparently epithets said before the stabbing. For a hate crime, you have to have a separate and independent crime, vandalism, murder, assault. And then if it was motivated by a protected characteristic, you have enhanced sentencing that becomes a hate crime. That is different than protected hate speech. And it's very hard for our young people who've been raised, being much better, I think, than generations before them about trying to be protective of each other, to understand that some of this we must tolerate. And I think the way that I try to explain it to them is to show that if we drew the line of hate speech at a certain level, saying that anything is, offensive or antagonistic based upon, for example, race, then a faculty member cannot come into class and talk about white privilege, right? Suddenly that's going to be the basis of a charge, and we can't have that intellectual conversation. Or the civil rights marches that happened in the 1960s would not be able to happen today, right? And so we have to be able to tolerate some of this unpleasantness, but we also need to make sure that we have policies that try to make sure we cover and address things that are true threats, things that are actionable harassment, things that are incitement.
I hate to close out what has been a really good discussion. I want to thank Bobby and Alan in particular for talking us through what you have learned in this process and the work that we all do. To summarize, there were some key things that I heard in what both of you said that I think are some takeaways for all of us. And that is certainly policy review. Take a look at policies, take a look at whether you've got the ability to determine placement of speakers. If you do, how does that work on your campus? Do you need to make changes? I heard a lot of things weaving through here of some incredible campus partnerships. In the middle of things, preparing for things and post with campus security, with presidents and provosts and others. This has to be a team effort if our campuses are going to deal with this. And part of our job can be, how do we identify and work with the team prior to anything happening on our campus? Really strong messages about paying attention to your staff. The human toll is high as you deal with these particular incidents, and I appreciate your attention to that. So I appreciate all of your efforts today. As Terry indicated, this will be recorded so we can come back to it. Resources will be shared on the public policy website of the things that were addendums to the conversation today. And let's keep the dialogue going. I know there will be some sessions as we move into the national conference in March, but I think the more we talk to each other, the more prepared each one of us is. So I thank you all very much for participating, and particular thanks to Alan and Bobby.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciated your input.